Hello and welcome to part 6 of Enlightenment in a Revolutionary World. Now we're going to talk about the origins of the French Revolution. Ultimately, we're going to see that the French Revolution did not result in libertarian or egalitarian or even constitutional and democratic processes. But it did, along with the Industrial Revolution, did mark the beginning of the end of the Ancien regime in Europe, right? It spread Enlightenment ideas down to the lowest social ranks, right? The French government finances had been passing in and out of trouble throughout the entirety of the 18th century, right? These financial problems were due to many of the recent wars that it had fought in, right? For most of the 18th century, the two wealthiest groups in the country, the aristocrats and the clergy, had paid a proportionally smaller amount of the taxes than the peasantry, right? These long-term problems added to the debts, and then throw on top of that 2 wars in the Americas, right? So Louis XV had actually imposed a special war tax on everyone, a tax on even on office holders. And he kept those taxes on the books despite the protest of the aristocracy and the clergy, right? This leads to a storm of protests from the nobles and the office holders, the local parlements, who argue that in the language of the philosophes, right, they say that this is infringing upon their natural rights, their ancient rights. Okay, so when in early 1787, Louis XVI called an assembly of notables to address the financial crisis in the wake of these 2 American wars, the financial crisis that still lingered, representatives of the nobility questioned whether or not there was really a crisis at all, and charged the court and the king with just wanting more money. They demanded to look at the books. By 1787, half of all the government revenue in France was being used just to pay the interest on the amount of debt they had built up. By early 1789, the French crown was in an absolute financial crisis. The peasants and the middling orders were expected to solve this crisis by paying the French tax bill. In general, the condition for the French peasantry in the 18th century had been improving, right? The peasantry had gone long periods in the 18th century without any famine. By 1789, the peasantry owned about 40% of the land in France. This is a much higher proportion than other European nations, right? But there was also a high tax burden, which meant that these peasants still lived on the margins. It would just take one bad thing, a bad harvest or two, to cause the peasantry to fall into poverty. Well, it just so happens that's what's going to happen. In the years of 1787 to 1789, you're going to have a series of bad harvests in France. This is going to lead to starvation amongst the poorest of the peasants and the loss of purchasing power by the rest of the peasantry, including the urban workers known as the sans-culottes. The sans-culottes literally means without knee breeches, right? Because these working class men wore trousers. Okay. Profits are down everywhere. Landlords react to this by raising the grain prices and the rents to maintain their profit margin. Peasants can't afford to pay this tally, right? And so you start to have some resentment. You start to have some protest, right? The traditional defender of the peasantry were the 13 regional parlements, right? Led by the largest, the Parlement of Paris. But in May of 1788, King Louis XVI, reacting to protests over taxes, high taxes, and religion, is going to abolish all the parlements. The financial crisis then is going to reach a boiling point in 1788. Law and order is going to begin to break down, and the people are going to begin demanding demand a meeting of the Estates-General. The Estates-General is an ancient French institution, and it hadn't been called since 1614, for those of you who remember the failed Fronde revolt during the 30 Years' War, right? Now, the Estates-General is a tricameral body representing the traditional estates of France, right? You have the first estate, which was the clergy, and the clergy at this time owned about 10% of the land. The second estate was the aristocracy, who owns about 25% of the land. And then the third estate was the commonality. It was everybody else, about 95% of the population. Okay. Any legislation in the Estates General had to win the approval of 2 of the 3 houses, right? The third estate, the commonality, was elected by all male adults, right? Anyone, if you were a male adult who was not a member of the first or second estate, you voted in the elections for the third estate. Now, given that poor farmers had little standing, little political standing, those elected were usually lawyers, bankers, merchants, the middle class, right? The middling orders. The middling orders, of course, had been reading the philosophes, right? So they took up the plight of the peasants. Local grievances were conveyed to the states through the Cahier de Lorentz. They argued for the end of absolutism, the absolute monarchy. They argued for the creation of a permanent legislature, right? So they create these arguments that no matter what representatives the third estate approved, the structure of the state generals dictated that they were going to have to win over one of the other 2 estates, the aristocracy or the clergy, right? So a flood of pamphlets began to appear demanding a vote by the head. In other words, by the head of the estate, by the people, not by the estate. All right. So the Estates General is going to convene in May of 1789. The king is going to vacillate here. He's going to refuse to rule on how he feels the estates should vote. Kind of leaves the estates in confusion. And so as a result, the third estate is going to invite members of the other 2 estates, members that at least seem to be pliant or sympathetic to their cause, to join them to form a national assembly in June of 1789. Some of these nobles and clergies had been reading the philosophes as well, right? So they did go ahead and join with these members of the third estate to create this ad hoc body, right? This group proclaimed itself the National Assembly on June 17, 1789. The government officials reacted to this by locking them out of the Estates General, right? They locked them out of the Parisian meeting place. So on June 20th, 1789, the National Assembly met in an indoor tennis court across the street from where the Estates General was meeting, and there they took what was called the Tennis Court Oath, which was an oath to remain until France had a new constitution. Now, again, King Louis XVI has an opportunity here to do something, right? Do something solid to either, one way or another. But again, he's going to vacillate. He's going to fail to react. His hesitation is going to only create a climate of growing fear, right? So by late June, the sans-culottes of Paris, encouraged by the formation of the National Assembly, but also fearful that eventually Louis XVI is going to crush it, are going to begin to organize, and they're going to begin to take some action.